Hello, my name is Meredith Poulton. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Today, I'll be giving a presentation titled Monstrous Women, the Function of Gender Roles in Cold War Era Propaganda. This presentation will focus on B movies and their use of gender roles to demonize communism for propaganda purposes. This presentation will be using a broader definition of a B movie, which is any low-budget film made for commercial purposes that is not considered an art house or independent film. The focus of this presentation will be on B movies that fit into the science fiction genre. B movies were an important medium as they were popular with younger people who were not necessarily as convinced as their parents that communism was a serious threat that should be eliminated by any means necessary. This became particularly important during the sexual revolution and later stages of the Cold War, as previous social moorings that helped separate the US from the USSR were becoming more fragile. Likewise, various diplomatic doctrines and attacks on communist countries became less accepted by younger generations, making propaganda against communism directed at younger people particularly important for the war effort. B movies were more likely to be shown to a teen audience as they had a higher chance of winding up in drive-ins and cheaper theaters, where teens were more likely to visit with their friends or dates. The kitchen debate was a debate between President Nixon and Premier Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union. The debate was so named because it was conducted in a model kitchen. As part of a diplomatic exposition of American consumer products and culture, officially to build understanding between the two countries, but was intended to increase Soviet citizens' demand for consumer products, something America was producing heavily at the time. The kitchen showcased all of the latest and greatest labor-saving gadgets, which Nixon highlighted to show that American women were liberated and well treated. However, Khrushchev disagreed, which began the debate. The kitchen debate cemented the difference in roles of women between the USSR and the US. Women in the USSR were encouraged to work, had access to childcare, and had easy access to birth control and occasionally abortions. They were also encouraged to take liberation from housework and government propaganda. They served their country in much the same way men did. American women were liberated by time-saving domestic devices, and in general were not given the same political or sexual autonomy granted Soviet women. They served their country by being dutiful consumers, performing domestic labor and childcare, making themselves attractive and generally supporting their husbands. Although women during this era worked, it was not something that was generally viewed as their role in society. The posters from this era didn't differentiate much between men and women, beyond the obvious differences in dress. This lack of differentiation went further than just visual media. In most political, sexual, and employment issues, women were meant to be treated as equals to men, with women being able to control their fertility and access household help and childcare without stigma as needed, which allowed them to work outside the home and pursue careers without the difficulties most women with families experience. The image of women in this era for Americans was of a young bride lacking secondary sexual characteristics or much intelligence or maturity. She had more in common with a petulant toddler than an adult, with even the food she was encouraged to eat being so easy a toddler could prepare it and generally suited to a child's tastes. Most propaganda and advertising encouraged this view of women, with few examples showing any indication that women could or should function as adults. Women were expected to enjoy domestic work and staying home. Although women in this period were employed in significant numbers, it was not encouraged, without much attention paid to other avenues for self-fulfillment or gratification. Women were not really viewed as independent beings, but existing for male pleasure. Even advertisements for traditionally feminine products like stockings catered to a male audience. Women were encouraged to pay special attention to their stockings to please their husbands, rather than because it would bring them personal fulfillment or give the end consumer a sense of pride or personal beauty. Advertisements later in the Cold War were still based on the belief that women existed for male pleasure and were created for a male audience. An advert for flavored lip gloss suggested women promised each of her suitors exclusive rights to a flavor, with a line reading, "Promise Roger your strawberry kisses." There are plenty of flavors left for Richie, Fred, David, Bob. The advert allowed for the idea that a woman could see multiple men romantically at once, but still held on to the belief that it was acceptable for men to demand to own a portion of a woman and encourage such behavior. The advert was marketing a product mainly used by female consumers, but focused on men and their discomfort with the idea of women having that much control over their bodies, showing that the earlier view of women being something a man possessed had not ended but merely become more flexible during the Cold War. This phenomenon also helps explain why women characters and the treatment of them were used to demonize communism. It was created predominantly for a male audience, who found it more uncomfortable to see women, even communist women, being openly sexual, and viewed American women as uniquely weak and fragile, requiring constant protection from the ravages of communism. The aliens represented communist invaders in the film Invasion of the Body Snatchers. For those who have not viewed it, the film covers an invasion of aliens that grow in pods which begin taking over a small town. As a human sleeps, the pod person takes on their characteristics until it eventually steals their mind. The only difference between the pod person and the original is that the pod person lacks any human emotion or empathy. This concept that the pod people were stand-ins for communists can be immediately recognized, with the pod people being accused of many of the same behaviors and fears that American attached to communists during this time. In the film, the main female character, Becky Driscoll, is shown repeatedly to be too weak and emotional to survive without her male companion's assistance. When attempting to impersonate an emotionless pod person, she breaks character when a dog is nearly killed in front of her. When provided stimulants to keep her awake, she still falls asleep. After falling asleep, she is converted into a pod person and betrays her male companion, who barely escapes being forcefully converted into a pod person himself. This plays on the idea that American women were so weak and pitiful that they'd be unable to withstand a communist invasion and would quickly become as awful as their Soviet counterparts. Sally, who before the invasion was a happy and devoted young mother, was converted into a pod person. Along with her comrades, she coldly plotted how to convert her infant daughter into a pod person while the child cried in its room. The process would have killed the child, yet Sally showed no concern with this, just remarked that she would not cry after the process was over. She even volunteered to place the pod in her child's womb, knowing what would happen to her daughter. This played on American beliefs that communist women were neglectful and inadequate, and concerned only with indoctrinating their children, so-called refrigerator mothers. The film Teenage Zombies is about a female scientist, Myra, who is employed by communist agents to design a biological weapon that will make the vast majority of Americans into zombies, only able to do the bidding of others. Ivan is the first such example of these zombies, a miserable and helpless man whose entire life has become doing endless toil for his mistress, Myra. Ivan represents the communist workers, who American propaganda often depicted in a similar way. Their entire life revolving around work, unable to make their own decisions, and lacking any autonomy in their personal life. The abuse Ivan is subjected to, and the plan to turn the US populace into a collection of drones, help justify the callous treatment of communist nations. Because they are crueler to their own citizenry, and the cruelty shown to those countries during the Cold War was justifiable, because eventually Western victory would liberate them, and those countries directly threatened the US as long as they were left without being attacked. Myra wears very pretty dresses, but spends the majority of the movie in a lab. Her clothing would have been a safety hazard at worst and a hindrance at best. Her outfits drew the audience's attention to her sexuality and suggested even when engaging in other activities she was still attempting to seduce men. When interacting with her male employers, she is assertive. She doesn't cover up or show any discomfort or subservience that was usually expected of a woman interacting with a man, especially one in a position of power at this time. Myra is meant to represent all Soviet women who are convicted of being horribly over-masculinized and hypersexual. Traits American women and men found repulsive and which offended their moral sensibilities and beliefs about what roles a woman was meant to fill. Women are expected to be selfless and caretakers. Myra is selfish and only seems to care for herself. American women were shamed for these same qualities heavily, and to see Myra unapologetically exhibiting them would have convinced the audience that Soviet women were the polar opposites of American women in every way, and a danger to traditional gender roles and family structure that they held dear. Americans were generally greatly concerned that incoming communist invaders would take advantage of vulnerable American women. This was not an unfounded fear. The Red Army had a documented history of using mass rape as a military tactic, which German women suffered greatly. The Soviet attitudes towards consensual sex did not share in the US's interest in sexual purintism. Although it differed at various points, for a portion of the USSR's history, access to birth control and abortions was granted to women without much difficulty. Likewise, at various points, women were encouraged in governmental doctrine to enjoy a sexual liberation their American counterparts had to wait a great deal longer for. Early in the USSR's history, people marched about in public nude except for an armband reading "Down with Shame." There was also a movement towards liberating women from household drudgery by making it a task the whole society took on, and in the process making love and sex a simple request rather than a long and drawn-out ritualistic affair. Americans grew concerned that male communists would be unable to control themselves or their sexual impulses, with no societal bonds that clearly discouraged sex, and would go about having sex with any vaguely female shape that was in possession of pulse. These fears were epitomized by Ivan, who the teenage girls' characters feared would sexually assault them and stared at them in a lecherous way for most of the movie. The Blob is a 1950s film about a gelatinous alien that comes to Earth and begins consuming the members of a small town to fuel its growth. The Blob represented the USSR, with its many victims representing Soviet workers. During the film, the Blob was shown to target old people, women on their own, etc., but didn't go after difficult prey until it was an impressive size. This showed that the communist state chose to exploit people who couldn't protect themselves and were unlikely to withstand its abuse for long. Americans were convinced that Soviet women were horribly treated, forced to perform labor better suited to a man, working long hours with a government that refused her access to anything that allowed her to maintain her femininity. Americans believed the Soviet government merely worked them until they collapsed. The Blob landing in a small American town played into American fears that the USSR was interested in expanding its sphere of influence into the US. Its use of women to further its growth played into these fears, as American women were widely depicted to be weak and fragile and unable to stand the rigors of difficult manual labor, which would make it unlikely that most women would be able to survive the work that Soviet women were regularly expected to do. Further convincing the audience of the film that the USSR was a direct danger to them, and it was an abusive and tyrannical government, whose growth, if left unchecked, would destroy the various women they held dear, and eventually them. The films discussed here convinced the audience that communism was a menace and if left unchecked would expand into the US and the rest of the world. They also showed that again and again that under communism women became like depraved men, performing men's work, working outside the home while ignoring their family's needs, and taking on the mannerisms and social behavior of a man. But without access to their femininity, they also became quite cold and quite keen to follow along with the demands of their society, even if that meant betraying those closest to them. They also showed that a traditional family structure could not exist where communism was, and that women would shed off their caretaking and gender roles in favour of working for the state under communism. It was also shown again and again that women under communism were not happy. They were horribly treated and exploited and surrounded by men who had no impulse control. Communism was a danger not only to men, but to American women and women everywhere, with Soviet men being perpetual rapists and women forced to abandon their families for the state and become refrigerator mothers if they were allowed access to their children at all. My paper researched only a small section of American propaganda and usage of gender roles. Particular attention should also be paid to mental hygiene in educational films. One such film that should be considered for further analysis, although a film created by the American government rather than a B-movie, is Red Nightmare. The film shows what happens when America falls to communism, with a wife becoming extremely cold towards her husband, sending her children away to a state school and collective farm, and eventually turning on her husband and reporting him to the state for execution. The film encapsulated the fear Americans had that their families and social mores would be destroyed under communism. Mental hygiene films such as Red Nightmare should also be studied to examine the role the education system played in spreading propaganda, particularly focused on the usage of gender roles to accomplish this. It should also be analysed to see how younger characters, a teen daughter and two small children who were already espousing communist rhetoric, were used to scold an unpatriotic father, and how the belief that men should care for women was weaponized in this film. And if there was a difference in the propaganda girls and boys were shown, and if so, why? Further research should expand into assessing more general product advertising and looking at various forms of media across time periods to see if any tropes that expand across time periods and why they do, and the impact of feminism, the role of the domestic science movement and the women's increasing access to work, and social power change the uses of gender roles in propaganda.